4.5 million Africans went to Brazil, about 4.5 went to the Caribbean, and only 500,000 came to the United States. So outside the United States, there's a great awareness of the African presence.
And where can that presence be seen, Hector, Evelyn?
Wow, that can be seen almost in everything. I have to say that I did live 2 years in Cameroon, and when I was there, I found so many answers about how I am, being from Venezuela. I can name food, way of interacting, sense of humor. Forget about talking about music, because we know it's very much embedded of African influence. But those just to name few aspects where you could see. I even think that literature, narrative, is also pretty much embedded with African influences in Latin America.
Hector?
Well, I think culturally and in the physical presence, whether you go to Cuba, Puerto Rico, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Brazil, where in Brazil you have 70 million people who identify as having African influence, and that doesn't talk about the other people who probably do have some ancestry, African ancestry. So if you're talking about just the physical scope, we're talking about approximately maybe 150 million people who identify as having some African presence. And then, like Evelyn's talked about, the culture, the language,
the food,
all right? And there's so many elements that compose what you call the Latino culture that comes directly from Africa that you can't just say, well, it's not part of the mix.
Now, in a place like Colombia, Ecuador, is the presence of African ancestry very prominent? And the reason I ask that is because you just don't see many dark Colombians or people from Ecuador in this country.
Right. Colombia has the largest black Spanish-speaking population in the world.
Do they identify as black
Almost definitely do.
Colombians?
Almost definitely do. However, in different sections of Colombia, where it's the Chocó, which is probably the most impoverished section of Colombia, you have in northern part Barranquilla, you have in one of our colleagues is doing research in an area called Palenque San Basilio, which is an African community to this day in the northern part of Colombia. And then you talk about Cali. In all elements of Colombian culture, the African presence is very pervasive. La cumbia is an African-based dance, and that's the dance that all Colombians assume is their own. All right, in Ecuador, you have the oldest sovereign non-Native American community. Esmeralda is a black community who signed a peace treaty with the Viceroyalty of Spain in 1565. And throughout Latin America, like in the Caribbean, you have communities of cimarrones or maroons that exist to this day, 200-300 years later.
Okay. Ron, the African influence in Cuba.
Oh, it's very profound. I think that there were runaway communities from shipwrecks and the very first trips of Christopher Columbus. Africans were involved either as free people of color or as people in some kind of servitude, some kind of situation of bondage. It's important also to think about a state like Mexico, which took the first Africans in 1528. They were able to free their Africans in 1828 because they had a long history by that time. They had 300 years of experience with Africans. And today there are communities of Africans in Mexico, around Acapulco, around Veracruz. There's also the study of African presence in Mexico in the university system. So it's 50 years of study of Africans in Mexico that we could think about, that we could look back on resources related to documentation, bibliography.
Is there much documentation about this African presence, though, in many of these places?
Well, one of the greatest places is the Schomburg Institute in New York, where there's a great fund of literature in Spanish and in English about the history of Africans. So the documentation is there.
Now, I have to say, for those who may not know, Arthur Schomburg was Puerto Rican, born in San Juan. Hector?
Most definitely. He was born in an area, excuse me, called Cangrejos, which today is called Santurce. And Cangrejo has been a haven for free slaves from other islands who used to come there and settle. And the Spanish allowed them to have their own community since the 1600s. And Schomburg came to the United States as a member of a Comité pro la Independencia de Cuba y Puerto Rico. He was struggling for independence from those two islands from Spain. And he settled in New York City. Began his collection after he was involved in revolutionary movements. He was a globalist because he talked about the Pan-African movement before that term became popular, and essentially created black history. But Arturo Alonso Schomburg.
Now, he started collecting this information because at one time in college, from what I understand, a white student said, blacks had made no contributions to anything or had never done anything, would never do anything, and he set out to prove that college student wrong. Is that correct?
It wasn't a college student, it was a teacher.
Okay.
Which, by the way, still goes on today in schools, not only in Puerto Rico, but here in the United States. So his reaction towards that is proving that person wrong, and now we have that collection.
Tell me some other Afro-Latinos who have made major contributions to our history that we may not be that familiar with. Evelyn?
Well,
Rafael Cordero?
For instance, Roberto Clemente, for instance.
Tell us a little bit about them. Hector, jump in if you can. Ron, Hector.
The irony is, I want to take this because I heard it from one of our colleagues, Johnny Disati, and I didn't know that Schaumburg was a student of a gentleman named Jose Julian Acosta, who was an abolitionist in Puerto Rico, white. But Jose Julian Acosta was the student of the first integrated schools in San Juan, which were created by Rafael Cordero and his sister, a black man. So Schaumburg actually has his roots with another black man in Puerto Rico, a poor black man. We could stay in here, and we've had 5 shows talking about all of the famous Afro-Latinos, Albizu Campos. In Puerto Rico, every political movement was started by a black person. Albizu Campos, Betanzas independence movement, the autonomous movement was started last century by a guy named Román Valdoriotti de Castro. The statehood movement, ironically, was started by a guy named Jose Cesar Barbosa, who graduated #1 at University of Michigan Medical School, who thought that statehood was the best route for Puerto Rico to take, but he was a black man. So that's just Puerto Rico. And we talk about Cuba, we be here again 2 days. Venezuela, the same thing.
Why is this information that we're hearing here today not documented and a part of our history, not even in Puerto Rico? Is that correct?
Well,
Evelyn?
It may have to do that most of our schooling system in Latin America and here too is very Eurocentric, and most of the achievement that been done by people of color, especially black people, are not really highlighted. So you have to, even though the information is there, as you say, in the Chamber Center and so on, you have to actually make an effort and go and search for that. That information is not made available easily to students at any level, elementary, high school, or college.
I think there's also a privileging of African American history. In many ways, Africans and Africans in the Caribbean and Latin America are an invisible community for many African Americans.
Why is that?
I think we assume that our history is the most important of all communities of Africans on the planet. Our civil rights movement, our struggle through slavery. But we sometimes forget that there were Africans in other parts of the world involved in different types of struggle. But if we look to the first revolution in the hemisphere, it was Haiti, which we consider a Caribbean country. So we have to readjust our sights as African Americans to be a little more inclusive.
Evelyn, you identify as an Afro-Latina. What is an Afro-Latina or Afro-Latino?
Well, I would say it's a name that some of us have taken to highlight our ancestry, our heritage, in a way until we can share and express to everybody that most Latin Americans do have inherited some African influence, either through the Middle Passage or through Spain, because Spain was occupied by Moors by around 800 years. So being Latin Americans, we have a lot from Africa via either Spain or via the slave trade.
Do black Latinos deny their black heritage, Hector?
That's a very complicated question. First of all, which ones and where? Okay, because we're talking about 150 million people, and it's very difficult to say this group does this and this group does that.
Let's start in Puerto Rico.
Depends on what part of Puerto Rico. In the northeastern part, which is essentially a free black community, and it's still intellectuals in Puerto Rico are still referring to all black Puerto Ricans as descendants of slaves in Puerto Rico. That's not true. The bulk of the African slave in Puerto Rico started after 1810 in the southern part. You had a free black population who essentially defended San Juan from British and Dutch attacks for 300 years. So you have people who say, yeah, I'm not really black. Then you have some other people.
What, if they say I'm not really black, I mean, what does that mean? Are they denying their black heritage, Evelyn?
Can I say something which is crucial? When a person of an English-speaking person asks, are you black, is asking something that's related to a concept that was created by British. For the British concept, if you have a drop of black in yourself, it doesn't matter how fair skin you look like, how straight hair you have, or how blue your eyes are, you are considered a black person. For the Spaniard, as long as you have a drop of white, you are no longer black. You know what I mean? So that creates a dichotomy of understanding who is black, which is tremendous different when we talk with, when Latinos are speaking with African Americans. When African Americans ask you, are you black? It's because, do you have any ancestor in your family that has been black? It doesn't matter if it's 10 generations ago. When you ask in Latin America, are you black? You're asking if a person has a phenotype like you or like me.
Evelyn, all right, you're Venezuelan, you're Haitian, you're a black Latina. Do you have to constantly try to prove that you are Latin to people, to other Latins?
Well, no Latino would ever speak to me in Spanish when we first encounter. And normally I let them struggle. Yeah, because in the beginning I was even hurt many times because a Latino would come up to me, not only in the street, I mean, working at Taller Puertorriqueño, I was the director of the bookstore for 3 years. Almost everybody who walked into the bookstore, either if they had a question in Spanish, they would pass by me and go talk to somebody else. And then the person had to say, no, she's the person. Oh, she doesn't speak Spanish. Or they would come up to me and I was speaking Spanish. Oh, you speak very good Spanish. And I would say, well, you too. You know, being ironic. And it's because they would never assume. And then after a while, oh, you're Latina. Oh, really? And then I would hear the comment, you don't look Latina. That I heard many, many times. So then I would ask them, what does a Latina supposed to look like? Because we come in all different shades and color. And then people then will realize what they're getting into, and then they, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't think, and that happens a lot.
What's your take on that, Ron?
I'm not surprised at all. I'm a Spanish speaker as well. I never hear anyone expect me to speak the language. Secondly, this English versus Spanish law, rule of law, is an important historical precedent. When we think about the first Africans who arrived here in the Americas, it's 1619 in Jamestown. 100 years earlier, Africans were arriving in Latin America. Not all of them were slaves. And earlier we'd spoken about this idea of the slave identity versus an African identity. And this is a question that I struggle with African Americans, my African American students. Do you want to have your primary identity as a former slave, or do you put it in the context of Africans, which widens the scope? It makes you really identify with a group of people on a global scale rather than a narrow national history. But I agree with much of what you say about how we're not expected to be Latin Americans if we're people of color.
Ron, a common complaint that you hear, that I've heard from Latinos, is that they are not accepted, that black Latinos are not accepted oftentimes by African Americans.
Well, as an African American, I've struggled with Latin students for a long time, this question of who am I really? I had a student 2 years ago who said, I don't want to be around African Americans anymore because they don't understand my history. He was a black Puerto Rican. And, you know, you have to put history in context to explain to people this is what you have in common, this is why your experience is similar. But our schools might not be doing that. Our institutions, the media, for example, is definitely not doing that. The media doesn't really represent people of color who are from Latin America in any, I would say, positive way.
No. Hector, you grew up in Harlem, New York. Did you find that you weren't accepted by African Americans?
Well, ironically, I live in two sections of Harlem. One in East Harlem, which you would call Spanish Harlem, which is a poor community, the community I moved to later, which you call Sugar Hill. I think I was more readily accepted in that section of Harlem, on 11th Street, 5th Avenue, than when I went to the western part.
Of Sugar Hill,
right,
where I'm from.
Right, well, you had a more privileged community, and all of a sudden I had to identify myself and put me into this box. And that created some difficulty. Now, ironically, my father had been all over the world, and he kind of prepared me for certain kinds of things. But yeah, I think that in this country, and in Latin America, you want to put people in boxes. And those boxes are very narrow according to your own experiences of what you've been taught. And again, dealing with people who don't come from those kinds of experiences, I'm going to rephrase that. I grew up in New York City, which meant that even I had my own limitations based on my own identity, because I thought, well, this is what the way Puerto Ricans look like. In Harlem, when I went to college in New Jersey, I said, Puerto Ricans don't look that way. They, of course, looked at me and said the same thing. So we all
Why was that, though? How different were they?
Well, coming from Harlem, I met a lot of black Puerto Ricans or black Afro-Latinos. In New Jersey, it turns out that most of the migration came from the center of the island, where people tend to be more light-skinned. So their view of what it meant to be Puerto Rican was based on where they came from. But a lot of those people came from directly from their town in Puerto Rico to the airport to the United States and knew nothing themselves about Puerto Rico.
Now, skin color and hair textures are still a very important, they're very not important, but major issues that Afro-Latinos struggle with today. Why is that?
Well, what's the old saying? White makes right. So the certain phenotypes that you have gives you more privilege. So therefore, if you lighter skin, have straighter hair, green eyes, that gives you a certain kind of value in the hierarchy of those phenotypes. So the more African you look, the less privilege you have. And it's no different among, it's the same thing among African Americans and Afro-Jamaicans and Afro-Haitians. We still subscribe to those value systems.
What about some of those quote-unquote endearing terms like negrita, negrito, mulatto? Oftentimes I've heard that negrito, negrita is an endearing term and is not derogatory.
It
but
depends on what nation.
Yeah, it depends on the nation, depends on the circumstance, depends on so many things. And the point I always tell people is I ask them, do you know the origin of that? Because at this point, yes, it could be a lot of time, mi negrita, mi negrito, mi negra, mi negro, endearing, but many times people don't know where that comes from. And sometimes when I tell people the origin, that's, you know, the houseboy being called mi negrita, mi negrito, people then would think about twice before then say it again. Besides that, I mean, for instance, we have the pelo malo, which is bad hair. That's something really common to say. I don't know in Puerto Rico or places in Cuba, but in Venezuela, most likely being black is equate to being ugly. If you're black, you're ugly. Or I've heard many times, you're black but beautiful. I mean, like, oh, you're an exception. I mean, it's exceptionally that a black person is beautiful, or you're black and intelligent, but intelligent, you know, this kind of thing. But at the same time, the person who says it doesn't want to mean to offend you openly. All the race issue is so taboo to talk about it down there that those things are very strongly coined in our culture, in our everyday being, but however, nobody had really questioned it. Well, it's been questioned, but not so much as it's been questioned here, let's put it that way. And yes.
I think in the Americas in general, in the United States particularly, race is a very difficult topic to talk about. We've not evolved in a language to really discuss race, particularly in the United States. Mulatto is not a word that most African Americans would be using in 1999. Exactly. It's more common in Latin America and the Caribbean. But
and that means that you are part white.
That you're of mixed descendants.
That's worse than that. It's worse. It comes from the word mule. A mule is a cross of the horse and the donkey. So a mulatto is a cross between a white person and a black person. Then again, that definition is not known in Latin America. I often tell people, do you know what mulatto means? And when I tell them, like, horrified, and then I decide not to say that again. But nobody knows or talk about that. At least in my circles in Venezuela, and I grew up and I lived there 30 years, nobody never discussed those issues.
What about indigenous? If a Latino or Latina says, I'm not black, I'm indigenous, how do you take that?
That's a very interesting question because so many people of African descent do have some Indian parentage. My childhood stories about my grandmother and grandfather being Blackfoot Indians, being Cherokee.
How many
I think that's a very common reality that we have to accept. But on the other hand, when you deal with these broad mixtures that occur in Latin America, where you have Africans escaping from communities of whites to live with Indians and mixing and having children of all different hues, it's just a very complex question that's very hard for people to tease out. What is my real ancestry when you have these unique looks, you have straight hair, you have green eyes, you're 6'4" in cases, you know, there are tall Puerto Ricans who don't look like what we would expect a Puerto Rican to look like. We have these generalizations that are all mixed up by our parentage.
But there's some issues that we have to talk about, particularly in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. That there's negation of the African influence by saying that you're an Indian. When the indigenous population, mostly Tainos, were eliminated by the Spaniards within 100 years of the Spanish presence, so that we've romanticized the Tainos and given them a positive value at the cost of the African.
So in other words, if you focus on your connection to the Taino Indian, are you rejecting your connection to your African ancestors?
Too often that's what's occurring. too often that's what is occurring. I mean, Dominican Republic, they've had ID cards that tell you that you're actually a dark Indian rather than saying that you're black. Okay.
Now, with as far as Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, there appears to be a I don't know how to nicely put it, but
a tension.
Yeah, one group putting down the other group. Why is that? Is it because of the darker skin?
I believe so. That's my personal opinion. The Dominican Republic has been an independent nation, and although a lot of Dominicans deny the African influence, when they come to Puerto Rico, and there's a number of Dominicans in Puerto Rico, then they get treated like they treat black people.
And how is that?
Rather badly. And ironically, there's a number of Dominicans who ironically have moved into the traditional centers of black immigration, Santurce, Loíza, and places like that, where they look just like the people who live there. And that seems to cause all kinds of tension. There's even Dominican jokes in Puerto Rico now. But often a lot of that is just as racist as the jokes against black people.
Evelyn?
I was thinking it's ironic because in the Dominican Republic, the black is the Haitian, and then the relationship that Hector is describing that happens in Puerto Rico with Dominican happens in the island, in the Quisqueya island, Española, from the Dominican towards the Haitians. So it's like a, you know, like a getting back some kind of treatment.
How do we educate our young people? What do we need to do to educate our young people, particularly young Afro-Latinos? Ron?
First of all, we need more literature that talks about the history in a profound way. Attending bookstores like Taller Puertorriqueño in Philadelphia, other bookstores that are in the metropolitan area. But we need to encourage our researchers to do more work.
Okay, how do we prepare our younger people and the future Americans for this new millennium?
I think history has to be rewritten or acknowledge the role Africans had played throughout and continue to play in the development of countries, all the Americas, all the American countries. I mean, talking about from Canada all the way to Chile, Argentina.
There are a group of Afro-Latinos who've been talking for a number of years about an open dialogue about black Afro-Latino consciousness. Has that gone anywhere?
Yes, actually, there is a network of black women that have been meeting every 2 years. There are groups all over. In Peru, there's Francisco Congo. There's Colombia. There are several groups in Venezuela, Panama. All the Garifuna communities along Nicaragua, Honduras have been also forming groups. In Brazil, of course, there are several groups. Groups have been growing and developing all over Latin America. I would say for the last 15 years that's been more oriented toward more active participation, and it's creating networks right now, and they're getting more together and creating, I mean, even like there is this person we met from Ecuador who have written this booklet to teach teachers how to teach history or to teach ideas about ethnicity in Ecuador. So more people are doing that. There is a Venezuelan activist too, Jesus Garcia, who's been doing the same thing and trying to make the school district include those topics in the teachings of elementary school. So it's getting there. We need a lot of education.
Hector?
Well, she forgot to mention the key one, Encuentro, which was founded by this young person here in Philadelphia, and we're all members of, who's beginning to deal with those issues here and try to tell the rest of the United States, and includes not only Afro-Latinos, African-Americans, non-Africans who are also interested in this subject, and bringing these issues to light. One issue that we didn't even talk about was the portrayal of Afro-Latinos in the Spanish media that some of us in our group is beginning to try to address.
Now, there have been letters that have been sent to Henry Cisneros, who heads Univision, about the images portrayed on that television network. Any results from those letters?
Right now, there's been a few responses. I think they're embarrassed, right? Because they know what they're doing is wrong. However, a number of those stations, some of those ideologies so programmed in Latin America that when you question them on that, they think that you have the problem. It's not their problem. For example, the issue that happened in Peru with all the advertising that was removed because of the work of African Americans and Afro-Latinos to stop supporting a show that was virulently racist against people of African descent.
Okay. Listen, I want to thank you very, very much for a lively discussion on a topic that needs to be continued. Thank you.
Thank you, too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for this edition of Another View. We'd also like to thank you for joining us, our viewers. And as always, we welcome your thoughts. You can write us at Another View, Post Office Box 777, Trenton, New Jersey, 08625. For Another View, I'm Belinda Morton. See you next week.